I'm feeling depressed or I have anxiety. I can't work anymore. They make the decision themselves without really discussing it fully with their treating doctors, or they just started treating with their doctors and they haven't created a history of treatment where an insurance carrier would say, okay, this has been enough treatment and this is severe enough to prove that they're disabled. So they'll call us and say, oh, I filed a claim, I got denied, I don't know why. And I would say, well, how often are you treating with your therapist and your psychiatrist? Are you on medications? Oh, well, I didn't know I needed to do that. So, they just assume because they're feeling a certain way and they can't work that they can just take themselves out of work without preparing the medical records as they need to be prepared. And oftentimes I say to them, it's best if you call us first before you decide you're going to apply, if you can do that. And that way we can get you prepared and give you advice on how often you should be treating, what your doctor should be writing in the records, because it's a dance.
Hi, I'm attorney Greg Dell, joined by attorneys Rachel Alters and Stephen Jessup. And Stephen, today we're going to talk about one of your resolved cases against Principal Financial, and this was a long-term disability appeal that you recently had. Every week we get together and talk about our resolved cases so that potential clients of ours and existing clients and all of our YouTube subscribers can learn about things that can help them to prevent a denial, or if they do get denied, what's it going to take to get benefits reinstated. So give us a little bit of the background of your particular case.
Yeah. This was first and foremost important. It was an individual disability policy, so one he had purchased privately, through an agent on his own. It wasn't an employer sponsored. He was a vice president of operations and supply chain, so he was like a logistics guy for a company and movement of the supplies. His disabling conditions were anxiety. He did have some complaints of migraines and cognitive problems, and he just got to a point where he felt he wasn't capable of being able to work. So on his own, and honestly, not with a lot of doctor support, filed a claim, with Principal. Principal did their usual review process. They did a phone interview. They actually ended up doing an in-person field interview with him.
Oh, wow.
And then they did 2 medical reviews of the available information. After receiving and looking at everything, they just came to it like, hey, there's not enough treatment here to support, because at that time he's only treating with a primary care doctor, not with a psychiatrist. I just recently started with a therapist, so they're like, there's no indication of a condition that's been around long enough to be severe, making arguments about appropriate care and things of that nature. So they denied his claim, basically saying, we think you're capable of doing your job. There's nothing that says you can't. And to their credit, it wasn't simply, we think you can do your desk job. They did really go into the vocational aspect of it quite a bit. The initial denial letter, I believe, was 18 pages long, kind of going through everything they had done, snippets of the field interviews, medical reviews, vocational, and we just don't see enough information to support it.
In these types of what we call the mental nervous claims, and Rachel, I know you've handled a ton of the mental nervous claims, how often do you see this, what we call this factual pattern scenario where the person goes and makes the claim, but they don't have enough medical support at that point in time? I know it's common, but why do we see it as such a common trend?
It happens often because people will think, oh, I'm feeling depressed or I have anxiety. I can't work anymore. They make the decision themselves without really discussing it fully with their treating doctors, or they just started treating with their doctors and they haven't created a history of treatment where an insurance carrier would say, okay, this has been enough treatment and this is severe enough to prove that they're disabled. So they'll call us and say, oh, I filed a claim, I got denied, I don't know why. And I would say, well, how often are you treating with your therapist and your psychiatrist? Are you on medications? Oh, well, I didn't know I needed to do that. So, they just assume because they're feeling a certain way and they can't work that they can just take themselves out of work without preparing the medical records as they need to be prepared. And oftentimes I say to them, it's best if you call us first before you decide you're going to apply, if you can do that. And that way we can get you prepared and give you advice on how often you should be treating, what your doctor should be writing in the records, because it's a dance.
What I find in your fact pattern is that somebody in that situation didn't just wake up one day and be like, I'm anxious, and then they run to the doctor. What was happening was it was going on for 6 months, 12 months, maybe even longer, where they were having these difficulties at work, or things started to fall apart at work, or things were falling apart in their individual family life, or whatever was really going on. But not a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to go to a doctor and think about it. There's a lag time of what happens. But unfortunately, claimants don't get the benefit of that lag time because what disability insurance companies want to see is treatment. So exactly along the lines of what you were saying is Principal, as much as they do one of the better jobs of any company out there, especially in the individual disability policy to review a claim, they're not really going to give you the benefit of, oh, you were suffering for 12 to 18 months earlier, unless there's some kind of medical documentation of that. So for example, had your client gone to a doctor 12 months before he filed and said, hey, I'm having these symptoms, or any mention of that, or ended up at the ER because he was having difficulty breathing or cardiac or whatever, and they say, oh, that's anxiety, that might have shown that was a trend. But it's hard to go before the date in which treatment starts. So, but for people watching this, they go, well, I didn't just wake up and I had that suffering. It wasn't like it was a traumatic event. So we do see that pattern all the time. But so Stephen, you had a big challenge ahead of you, like we do on most of our mental nervous claims. So what were you able to do to convince principal? I mean, they did an 18-page denial letter, which is extensive compared to the 2 or 3 pagers that we're used to seeing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is what usually happens in these situations. Provide objective evidence of the subjective complaints, and to going what you said, it is true. He had been dealing with it for a long time, but he's vice president level. He just sucked it up and worked through it until it got to a point that he couldn't do it anymore. One of the gambles of sorts that we take, the complaints of the cognitive side, looking at that, there was an MRI that had been done that showed some level of white matter change that maybe is associated with it. That didn't pan out anywhere. That came out as inconsequential from other doctors' opinions on it. But we sent for neuropsychological testing, a full battery of it, which, knowing that, although he suffers from migraines, the basis of the disability is mental health derived, not neurological. So the neuropsychological testing geared towards finding a neurological basis for it may not show everything, right? Or present in a way that would establish where the problems were. But we felt that given, his level as he was in work, knowing how the principal is going to look at it, these individual disability policies pay large benefits. So you want the strongest evidence that you can. We did send him for neuropsychological testing, which ultimately can't give a diagnosis of a neurocognitive disorder because there's no neurological basis, but did find a myriad of issues and deficits in memory, executive functioning, processing speeds, and all that. And the patterning of it was indicative of a severe anxiety disorder. So we did that. His primary care doctor, who's great, was always supportive, got attending physician statements and statement from him. And then even from his therapist, worked with him with behavioral health questionnaires and also additional statements, because the treatment with the therapist was newer in time. So we were able to try to work with him to, in your training, education, and experience, knowing, your treatment of this patient, would you expect that these symptoms would have been in existence from such and such time, to try to, backdate? Because the argument is, well, he just started treating with this guy. It's not contemporaneous to the filing of disability. So we did those items to try, because we were lacking a lot of substantive treatment. And we submitted the appeal, and it was not without its difficulties. There was quite a bit of back and forth, additional information being requested, another phone interview with the client they wanted to discuss. And then eventually they did admit liability on it. Now, with the caveat, though, because they did have issues that he wasn't with a specialist and getting appropriate care under the policy, wanting to see higher levels of medical care. Because a lot of times these mental health claims, well, there's no referral to in-house or outpatient, intense outpatient therapy or more medication. So can it be that bad? And I think one of the saving graces, too, is the fact that they did look so deeply into his vocational side in the initial denial. They had already laid most of the groundwork to understand what the duties of his job were going to be. So although his primary care doctor is like, listen, could he do something else? Probably. I don't think he could go back to what he was doing. And that, just the pure own occupation nature of the policy, knowing that there's no concerns on 24-month limitations for mental health or anything like that, we were able to get it established there. But, just because he's on claim now, mental health claims are always, I wouldn't say challenged, but I'd say scrutinized, because they're always looking for improvement through the course of treatment. And if you're not showing improvement, then they say, well, are you getting appropriate treatment? So, even though they're quiet, I think we actually just did a semi-annual review within the past month or so, and everything's still good to go. But it was a long fight. He was losing quite a bit of hope in winning it. Was looking into possibilities of doing private consulting and other things of that nature. But, principal, they did right by him. It was just a long fight to get there. But I think it is case in point. What you say, Greg, we in a prior video, you had mentioned like the insurance companies don't care what you say. And that's maybe a little harsh, but they're not going to take what you say at face value. It has to be supported in the medical, and even if it's, in the medical, we've discussed how doctors don't always document properly. How many times have clients said, well, I told my doctor X, Y, and Z. I'm like, it's not in the record, so it doesn't exist for that purpose. But it was a tough one, but, principal approved it.
And speaking of records, where you just brought that up, I mean, I know we've been telling all of our clients pretty aggressively lately, every time you go to the doctor, get a copy of the medical record. It may not be ready immediately, but call up the day or two after. They'll give it to you for free. Look at it, because we're seeing routinely that things that either the patient told the doctor are not in there, or things that they didn't necessarily say or might have said a year ago or 6 months ago are in there that shouldn't be in there. It's more often what's not in there that's the problem. And what a patient can do is either call up the doctor and say, look, you forgot to put this in, I need an addendum, or next time you go, make sure it's in there. So we're being very, very proactive in telling all of our clients, like, you need to do this every single time, because what happens is you may get denied, it's leading to denials, unfortunately. Then we get the medical records and we can't rewrite history. It's already done. But you can 2 days later go to the doctor, because it's the digital file, and get it amended. So that's a big takeaway.
And I think important to that as well, my chart and those types of things are not the official medical records.
Yeah.
And that what's in their official medical record is what the insurance company is going to look at, and that can differ from the information in my chart. So,
but with the mental health cases, mental health conditions, we often, I don't know, at least a lot for me, I don't see a lot of those records online. And another thing, talking about psychologists and psychiatrists, they don't often keep a lot of notes, I find, because they're treating the patient, not the chart. A lot of it's cash pay, especially in the psychology world. And they have these real personal relationships with the claimants, and so they're putting in very minimal notes. Now, that's probably fine for treating, because you have that human to human reaction, but that is an absolute dagger for trying to get disability benefits approved. So we so often have to work with the treating provider to create a narrative, like a narrative summary, which is totally appropriate. It's almost become like an industry norm. I mean, that's, for me, like when I call a psychologist, they're like, well, I have to put it together. I don't know if they don't have the same medical record requirements, or they're just so little, but it's very normal to go back to the psychologist or psychiatrist and ask them specifically for a narrative that's detailed to the treatment, the complaints, the diagnosis, the whole battery of how they do giving them the GAF scores and all of that type of stuff. So
I actually tell my clients to bring a list of complaints to the doctor every time they go, and change it up each time and hand it to them and tell them to put it in the record. Because oftentimes they say, well, I tell them all these things and they don't write it down. I said, okay, then bring a list of everything that's bothering you, hand it to them, and ask them to put it in your medical records. And that way it does become part of the records, and the doctor has it, in writing.
That's good for mental, nervous, or physical.
All of it, yeah.
Any claim.
I tell them to do it.
Well, congratulations on this victory. And I know it's a win for the claimant. It's a big deal for anyone to give up their job, but especially when you're giving up a high-level executive management position, a logistics manager, like you were saying, because those jobs are not just sitting around, like, oh, I'm just going to go get this other job. It doesn't happen. And this person obviously struggled for a period of time beforehand and didn't really have an alternative, and it's taking a substantial financial cut to be on disability. So it's a sad situation, but now, there could be a road to recovery for this potential claimant, hopefully with treatment. But if not, I know that it's going to be a constant evaluation, like you said, now every 6 months, and the client and patient has to continue with the regular treatment, because principal's going to be aggressive and looking at this file all the time. And if they find a reason to deny the claim, they're going to do it. So you can never let your guard down. So if you're someone out there with a principal financial claim, feel free to reach out to Stephen, Rachel, myself. No matter where you live in the country, we're available to assist you, and we'll always provide you with a free initial phone consultation.